It is my honor to introduce Bruce Bullock, Director of the McGuire Energy Institute. He's going to moderate this. Bruce has been at the McGuire Energy Institute since 2008. He's often cited by the media as an expert in the oil and gas industry, and is frequently guest speakers at events like this and other organizations in the industry. Mr. Bullock served on the staff of the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives from 1982 to 83, and then after that worked for Atlantic Richfield Company here in Dallas, where he analyzed federal and state legislation and regulation. In 1988, Bullock held several corporate communication positions at FMC Corporation, and in 2000, he took over Director of Corporate Communications for FMC Technologies. In this role, he managed all internal communications, public media relations, and brand management, employee volunteer programs, and government relations at FMC. Please welcome Bruce and our panels.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate the kind introduction, and we've got a great panel here today. We're going to pivot a little bit and talk more on the policy side. The title of the panel is "Making the Law Work." We're going to focus on a couple of different areas. First, we're going to touch on the north-south from Canada to Mexico. As many of you know, there have been a number of reforms that have passed in Mexico that offer companies in Texas and the U.S. and Canada some opportunities to further integrate the North American market. So we'll be discussing that. One of our panelists couldn't make it today, so we've got Texas and Canada here. So we'll do our best to extrapolate from there. And then we'll go in and discuss some other policy issues that are facing us as an industry, both here in Texas and Canada and the U.S. So we've got a great panelist, and we also want, given the issues of the day, to be able to take plenty of questions from you. To my immediate right, our first panelist needs no introduction. The Honorable Christy Craddock, who is chair of the Texas Railroad Commission. Many of you know her or have become familiar with her and her role. She's been chair since 2012, and she has had a focus on modernizing the agency and providing sensible regulations. She is a Plan 2 graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and a law graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. To her right is Gaetan Caron, who is an executive fellow with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary and former CEO of the National Energy Board in Canada. And then to his right is Ron Schindler, who is Vice President, Legal and Chief Compliance Officer of Pioneer Natural Resources in Irving. His law degrees from the University of Denver, and he's also a geologist as well. So we've got a great panel, I think, that can touch on a number of issues that are hot buttons of the industry right now. I'm going to start out on the issues related to the north-south integration, and have each of our panelists first touch on what they see as the opportunities are, as well as the challenges from a legal, economic, and a regulatory point of view in terms of integrating further the North American energy market. Chairman Craddock?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me this morning, and thanks for the introduction. Although I will clarify, I've only been chairman since last year, but I've been on the commission since 2012. So we rotate the chairman amongst ourselves. We are not appointed or elected to that, but the three of us make that vote. So, But I think we've got real opportunities. So welcome to Texas, because we have an energy plan in the state. When you look at Texas, we're probably the only place in the country when you look at our markets who actually have a a portfolio that would be a national energy plan. And so we are a perfect example of what you should be doing. But when you look at our friends in Mexico, and you look at what we're doing in Texas, and you know, because I'm a UT graduate, I get to say what starts here changes the world, and it literally has. When you look at the shale revolution, started right at here in the Barnett Shale. So did hydraulic fracturing, started here 60 years ago. So we've started the new technologies in this state. And so when you look, we have at the Railroad Commission, countries come in from all over the world and other states trying to figure out what we do and how we do it best. And one of the things I think we've done well historically is have good, fair regulations that people want to do business in Texas. And when you look at Mexico, and when we've talked to our Mexican counterparts, and they are changing rapidly. We've heard this morning how fast this industry is changing. When you're a regulatory body, you kind of plod along generally. We've done more at the agency since I've been there rule-wise in the last two and a half years than we've probably done in 10, by the way, because things are changing so quickly. We're watching Mexico change quickly. I think their challenges are going to be, one, to put good rules in place, and that's important for both sides of the border, first and foremost for us. And we have had some conversations as agencies back and forth of how we're set up, what our rules are. And so that, I think, is a challenge, that they put good rules in place, because our border, our entire Texas border, is going to be affected with what Mexico does, from El Paso all the way down to Brownsville. We've heard about the Eagle Ford this morning. Burgos Basin's just across the river, although it's the same geological formation, we just have two different names. So we want to make sure they've got good well casing technology, good water technology and what they're doing, because we share our water sources back and forth. We want to make sure that they are putting good rules for air emissions in place, because what we're finding from the federal government, first and foremost, is that they are now regulating much more so our air emissions. Everybody's kind of this past week talked about clean air issues coming to Texas, trying to regulate existing coal plants and what we do going forward. Natural gas is a nice answer, but all of the wind that we have in the Permian Basin and up in the Panhandle isn't being counted to our quality of air issues that we're going to have with EPA. And we get Mexico coming up there. In fact, I joke, and it may be what's got my nose this morning, the wind that brings up Mexico fires come about this time of year. So our air quality is a big piece for what they're doing. But when you look at the regulatory piece for us, and it really has to do with a federal government having a challenge of how they regulate oil and gas, quite frankly, and how we work with our neighbors, both north and south. So when you look at, I'm going to pick on one since I've got my Canadian neighbor sitting next to me, you look at the Keystone XL pipeline. The Railroad Commission, we gave the permit in 2008, and the southern end of it, as most of you know, has gone into place and is now active from Cushing to the Gulf Coast for the last 15 months. But we've got a little problem right at the border, and it's a problem on the northern end because, interestingly, on our southern borders, we're permitting pipelines pretty regularly. And so getting pipelines, for instance, out of the politics of Washington is going to be really important for us. Getting energy out of the politics of Washington and having fair, consistent regulations for LNG terminals, which we're going to have several on the Gulf Coast. It's where the first one's going to open by the end of the year. But they're doing them piecemeal. Opening our borders and opening exports for us and making sure we're exporting crude is going to be important for all of us to be competitive. So the regulatory process in DC gets stuck. But if you look at states, I think we do it pretty well. And we want to make sure that Mexico in particular, because that's our southern border for us, is putting good rules in place and realizing that what they do affects us, and what we need to realize what we do affects them too. And so they're seeing the dollars that we're spending in the Eagle Ford. So for perspective, last year we issued, I need to back up to 2008. We all knew the Eagle Ford was sitting there, right? In 2008, we issued 26 drilling permits in the Eagle Ford area. Last year, the Railroad Commission issued 5,600 drilling permits in the Eagle Ford area. That's the growth we've seen at that part of the border and that part of the state. It's huge. And you've heard about the Permian. I will say that's to come, because that is, I joke, you ain't seen nothing yet in the Permian. But we're seeing in the Eagle Ford with $28 billion of investment last year. Mexico wants that to happen to their country too. So their rules and certainty for them is going to be really important. But we need to be able to have a cross-border good conversations and not have holdups in DC, because I think as states we're doing our part.
Gaetan?
Thank you, Bruce. I'd like to give you a slightly different perspective on things from what has been said so far today, from the lenses, of course, of a Canadian. A Canadian who has been involved actively in regulation, but no more in terms of practical academia, with even more intellectual freedom I've ever had. And I'd like to tell you, as my punchline, that when you look at the trade between our three fair nations, that, to use the expression, is the glass half empty or half full? I'd say that the glass is almost full, and sometimes overfilling in terms of what's going right about the energy of the transfer of energy between our three nations, as I said. Not perfect, and I will unite with you about some things about pipelines in a moment. But let's talk first in terms of the politics of the energy trade between the three countries. I'll start with Canada, US, and if you Google the statements made by the US ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, I picked that up in Globe and Mail just a few weeks ago. The ambassador declared the two countries best friends with shared values, the world's largest unprotected border, and an affinity for tackling global problems and building things together. Our own ambassador to US, Gary Dewar, described Canada as an ally of the United States very recently, in spite of the occasional trade disputes we have between the two nations. So we have countries between the two of us, and I'll talk about Mexico in a second. We exemplify what a modern democracy looks like between us. We are governed by the rule of law, with fair courts and competent enforcement of the laws, strong public institutions, including your commission, Ms. Chair, and freedom of speech and freedom of expression, including freedom of being against pipeline projects and against this and against that. So that's part of democracy. And this is what we formed together as two nations, a very favorable political commitment to working together. And I'd like to talk about integration in terms of a few dimensions. The amount of energy flowing back and forth. There's a lot of oil and gas flowing between the three nations every day, very silently, very uneventfully, all the time. And I'll have a few numbers to say in a few seconds to just back up my point, Bruce. Political commitment through laws such as NAFTA since January 1st, 1994. So uneventfully, every day there is international law that protects the free flow of energy between the countries. The energy ministers of the three countries met in Washington in December, signed an MOU to work together in facilitating the movement of oil and gas and electricity and renewables between the three nations. They met again on April 22nd, or recently, and on April 22nd, and Minister Rickford, to talk about the environmental side, our own Minister of Energy declared on April 15th that Canada and the US are kicking off discussions to implement cross-border greenhouse gas emissions regulations in the oil and gas sector. And I say that's good news in the sense that the environmental factor to the free movement of energy is there. It won't go away. It will get worse before it gets better in terms of social acceptability of oil and gas development. And to tackle it openly, transparently with a plan and objectives is a good thing in the end. And there is policy alignment in many, many forms. The three regulatory agencies that regulate a great deal of oil and gas in Canada, US, and Mexico City, the CRE in Mexico City, the NEB, and the FERC, they meet 3-4 times a year between senior officials, talk about what's going right and see things coming. So you have a lot of good people with good intentions working on integration every day, and you can see that in the numbers. Our export policy as a nation is one of open markets. Canada believes that the freer the market, the better it is. It is relatively easy to get an export license from Canada for long-term exports, subject only to Canadians having fair and equitable access to the same oil or gas or electricity. And because we believe in free markets, there is always a way to find gas and oil and electricity at competitive prices. So that's not an issue. And we believe as a nation that free market maximizes the benefits to everybody, producers, consumers, and governments in terms of their revenues from royalties and taxes. And the economic rent can be more optimally allocated by the market forces than some bureaucrat trying to limit the exports here and there between nations and things like that. We have a differential in oil. I'd just like to refer to what was said earlier this morning about the differential in terms of American oil due to export limitations. Our differential in terms of price of oil in Canada is due to lack of pipeline space. That's very good news for OPEC, but it's not so good news for American and Canadian and Mexican consumers or producers, because there is value there to be grabbed in terms of economic rent that cannot go because of some limitation. In this case, in our case, for infrastructure. So just a few more figures, Bruce, before I conclude. Every day, we export 3 million barrels of oil to the United States of America. That's out of a total production in Canada of about 4 million barrels a day. So 3/4 of oil goes to the US every day. I heard from our Canadian Council people that actually in the front end of 2015, the amount of oil and oil products reaching Texas is more like 3.3, 3.4 million barrels a day. So it is not going down in spite of difficulties with the pipeline side. We will produce about 4 million barrels per day. We produce about 4 million barrels per day now. We'll produce about 5 million by 2020. And as Tim Dove showed in this very telling graph this morning, Canada is among very few nations increasing its total oil production. But you have to look at the long term as well. And I'd like to tell you that your own EIA has said that by 2028, the US will become an exporter of energy. When it comes to oil, however, the US will require crude imports for the foreseeable future. From 6.2 million barrels per day in 2013 to 2.3 million barrels per day in 2040. So Canada is by far the US top oil supplier in terms of what you need to import. And more to come as long as we allow market forces to keep that happening. Gas side is the same story. We produce about 15 BCF of gas per day. Of that, 8 BCF per day is exported to the US, and we import from you 2 or 3 BCF per day. So, and I'd like to say now just a few words before I conclude on the situation in Mexico. I happen to know the situation in Ciudad de Mexico because the School of Public Policy is engaged in a collaboration with the Mexico Secretary of Energy, the CRE, the Upstream Commission. And we've had the pleasure in January to spend a week in Mexico City to just have an informal dialogue as to how we can help as Canadians support Mexican institutions to fully leverage the effects of the constitutional reform, which was an act of great courage politically by the president and I think Congress overall in Mexico City, and passing all the secondary laws and now doing the very difficult task, the devil being in the details of creating programs and policies and regulation to make that work. And I've been monitoring Mexico for the last 20-some years, having been part of trilaterals and bilaterals since the early 1990s. And I've never seen anything like that. I just support your comments, Madam Chair. They're going there. They're moving as fast as they can with limited resources. And I think they need our support in terms of the patience that comes with trials and errors as you create new, very strong institutions, a very favorable investment climate, and very good enforcement of safety and environmental protection in the country. Mexico is a country to watch. Mexico will need more natural gas from the States before they can export any natural gas. They have a lot of capacity to export more oil. And I'd say that for the world as a whole, more oil coming out of North America is good news for North Americans, and I hope we see that in growing amounts in years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ron, I'm going to phrase the question to you a little bit different way and ask you to put your the hat on for the independent industry as a whole. I know one of the objectives of the liberalization of the law in Mexico is to try to attract shale expertise across the border. The theory being that the geology doesn't stop at the border. And I know Pioneer and many of the other shale players are U.S. focused. What kind of environment do you think it's going to take to attract companies like Pioneer, EOG, and others to make that leap?
I think I think that that's a multifaceted question, and I'll try to answer at least parts of it. Since Tim led off the discussion this morning, there's probably a bunch of the stuff that he said that plays into this. But from what he said, and referring to the glass analogy, our perspective, our glass is not mostly full. Our glass runneth over. We have 20,000 potential wells that we need to drill in the Eagle Ford and in the Permian Basin, and that's a very attractive place for us to be. What we look for as a company is we look for agencies that are supply predictable outcome that is basically not going to be changing over time very much. Now, that's not to say that here in Texas things are static. It's far from that. There are all kinds of problems and all kinds of challenges that we're having to address and figure out here in the state. But we're sort of blessed to be in a state that has a railroad commission that rolls up the sleeves and looks at the problems and invites some of those professionals to the table and with their own professionals and says, here's a problem, how do we fix that problem? I think that anytime a dollar appears on the world stage, there are dozens of operations and dozens of places competing for that dollar's interest. And so in order to get some of the major companies into Mexico, I'm not exactly sure what that will take, but I'm positive that the more a person can focus in on the consistency of placing investment on the ground and knowing that you're going to be able to enjoy the success from that investment, that's a key. Here in Texas, we will put in a pad of tank battery, and when we put that tank battery in, we will have plans for the next multiple years, and there at certain parts there might be 60 or 70 wells that are linked up to that particular tank battery. That type of consistency, that type of predictability with the law and with the agency, and knowing that if a problem arises, there are folks on the Railroad Commission that are willing to roll up the sleeves and say, okay, here's the problem. Is there a technical solution? Is there a legal solution? Is it a little bit of both? And how do we make it so that we're not changing the law, but we're just tweaking what we have to make it function with the new technologies and the new talents that we have emerging.
Thanks.
Got something more basic.
You want to comment on that? Sure.
I want to add on to, because I think it's something even more basic when you're talking to companies, is infrastructure, first and foremost. So, if you're going to go into the Burgos Basin, for instance, and I think a lot of you, if you haven't, you can go Google it on the World Wide Web. There's a picture of the Eagle Ford and the lights lit up at night, and then you look at our border of Mexico, and it is black on the southern part where the Burgos Basin is. So electricity, roads, pipeline infrastructure, which we're all behind. We only have 40% of the pipe built in the country that we need infrastructure-wise at this point. Where people are going to live, where you're going to get water, that's part of the certainty in electricity. How you're going to, even if you produce a well, how are you going to get it to market? Because whether it's by rail or pipe or road, you've got to have that predictability. I think that's still part of the challenge that Mexico has long-term. And then we all obviously talk about security on that side of the border as well, and they're really beginning to address that, which I applaud them for that. But that's another long-term challenge if you're talking to a company, no matter where they're operating, and we get this, and we try to work with companies at the Railroad Commission as well, but part of their risk portfolio is security for their employees and how far out, like in the Eagle Ford, we've had companies say, we won't drill that well because we're 200 miles from a hospital. And if there's a safety issue, we want to make sure that our employees are protected and have a place to go if there's an accident, for instance. So those are some issues that I think Mexico will have to deal with too before. And predictability of rules obviously is very important, but I think they're going to have to deal with some of those issues first and foremost. And that's some feedback we keep getting from the border, even the border towns. They all want to see what Mexico's going to do because they want to make sure they don't get an influx, although they want to be the launching point, by the way. Cities along the border want to be a good launching point, but they don't necessarily want all the problems that could potentially come. So that's, I think, one of the other challenges Mexico has first and foremost.
Thank you. I'm going to broaden the scope here a little bit and just to throw out a general question and get each of you to respond, and then we'll open it up for questions. As you look at the policy environment now, I mean, we've got a pretty good idea of some of the issues that are coming or not coming out of Washington, as you just mentioned. But there are a whole host of other issues in terms of the role of localities versus the role of state versus the role of federal governments. We've the infrastructure issues that you mentioned and so forth. If I could, environmental issues that you mentioned and so forth, if I could get each of you to touch on, if you do a little threat analysis out there right now, what you see as the number one issue out there from your perspective that worries you the most in terms of this industry at night?
Who do you want to go first? So I'm not sure that there's any one issue that is the big issue out there. I think that it's more of a where are the regulations headed? Currently, we have an increased amount of interest in several of the agencies of Washington, D.C., who previously have been a little bit more quiet than they are these days, and they are currently inserting themselves and asking questions and indicating that they have interest in promulgating rules. Some of the rules that have been talked about are probably very well founded, but it sort of turns into being the proof being in the pudding. Oftentimes the rulemaking process is what comes out of the end of the pipe isn't anything near what went into the pipe. And so what we try to do as a company and as a corporate citizen is we try to engage early and work with legislators and with regulators, and oftentimes there are questions that particularly the national regulators have that if you can clear up for them prior to them putting their position down and moving forward with something that doesn't work or isn't possible, you can often do them and you a huge favor. I think that there's going to be an increasing challenge between who has the ball. You know, what does the state regulate? What does the federal government regulate? What do the locals regulate? I think that each of those entities is going to be pushing for and trying to expand their reach and their SWAT in the regulatory fields, and oftentimes the corporations get caught in those tug of wars as to, you know, who exactly is carrying the ball on this one. Is it the Railroad Commission, or is it somebody in Washington, D.C., or is it somebody in the town next door?
How about a Canadian perspective on that?
what keeps me awake at night, I guess, is a question in a sense, is the quality of debate we're having in the world about our energy future as a planet. And I'm saying that mostly as a grandfather with my two grandsons are too young to be here to be part of this debate. One cannot even crawl yet, the other one barely talks. But when we look at the future, we're supposed to make decisions today that will not compromise the future of these generations. That's what the Brundtland Commission report asked us to do in 1987, and everybody still believes in the strength of that argument. And as a process, Brundtland also asked us to integrate into one gesture when we make decisions, the social, environmental, and economic dimensions. And we live in a world where you can fight for the environment and get away with that and not deal with economy and social. Or you can fight for, a social movement and forget about how much money you can spend to cause that. Or you can fight for jobs and ignore the environmental consequences. The debate we're having is not about how we can make this work together. It will take a strong economy to pay for environmental programs and social programs. And we have a debate, at least in Canada, and I see that in the United States as well, where it is, I'm for this, I'm against that, and most of the time people are against things that have in them the concept of infrastructure, as you said. And we need a lot more, and we need a lot more renewables, and we need a lot more technology to innovate. We need a lot more reduction in per unit of output consumption, and we need oil and gas. And in Canada, it's almost ridiculous. A great deal of Canadians are almost ashamed of the strength of the natural resources because it's developed in a way which is criticized as being insufficient. Yet our environmental record is at least as favorable as the best nations outside of North America. So I look forward to a place where we can debate more effectively with facts and figures how we can create the world that we are aspiring to. People in the environmental movement love a scenario by the International Energy Agency called the 450 scenario. That's a scenario where you will produce no more than 2 degrees Celsius changes in the planet's average temperature by 2040 or 2050. Well, that scenario shows that at 2040, we need more oil than we produce today. So where will that come from? We say, we won't produce Canadian oil because we don't like it. It's not clean enough. So we'll have Iran produce it, or Iraq, or Venezuela, or Nigeria, or Russia, and we'll keep this Canadian oil down because it has a label assigned to it, which is not desirable, apparently, in spite of the evidence. So in a nutshell, I look forward to a civil society evolving in the next year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, where we integrate the 3 dimensions of sustainability, just like the Brundtland Commission asked us to do, and accept that the future is made of compromises in terms of economy and the environment, and that we need evidence-based factors to make these decisions, and be ready for people being upset about these choices and move forward still, and allow some infrastructure in wind farms, in solar, and pipeline to get built, so that my grandsons have at least as good a future as my present has been.
Madam Chairman?
We took part of mine. I will say this. I think education is obviously the theme that you're hearing from all 3 of us in one respect or another. Education about this industry, education about what we do, and why it's important to the country and to the world, and why it's important for all of us, whether you're a regulatory, you're a researcher, you're an operator, to all work together. Because I think that's where this industry for a long time has just put their head down and assumed that everybody understood what they did and assumed that they knew why it was important. But when it's sitting in your backyard, or when you don't have enough of it for whatever reason, or when the price at the pump goes up, or the price of their electricity, of somebody's electricity goes up, which is all anybody sees at the end of the day or thinks about, the normal general public, education's a real important piece that we've left out for a long time and have forgotten to do. And I mean educating the public and having a good discourse, and not you're killing my child over here, but where's the facts? What do we need to be doing realistically? So that, I think, is a real piece of it. But I have to say, on a practical part, and Tim touched on it this morning, when I look at my agency and I look at this industry, the practical piece is I'm concerned about where we're going to get good workers and how we're going to educate them. Because we have a graying of an industry. I have 30% of my agency can retire tomorrow. 30%. And we've got new people coming on, but then we train them, and by the way, industry steals them, and I say quit stealing my people on a regular basis. But that is a problem for us, and it is not just high-level account exec type folks. It is, you can train and tomorrow be a welder on a job because we are short all levels up and down of educated in this industry workforce. And so where we get workforce long-term for an industry that is going to continue to grow along our borders and across this country and across the field, that's a real long-term challenge for us.
Just to kind of add to that, I know my good friend and colleague from TCU will be in here this afternoon, Ken Morgan. I think he would agree with me on this, but I have programs here at SMU, and he has programs at TCU, and our counterparts in Oklahoma and at UT and A&M and elsewhere. We have grown our programs to put people in the energy industry substantially since the mid-2000s, and I'm happy to say that despite the current price environment, we still have students lined up at the door ready to take our courses. Our courses are full. And I think all of us have put out some of the brightest young people that I've had the privilege of knowing in the past 3 or 4 years. So I think that's a real hopeful sign. And I'm also happy to say that in terms of the employers that have come and go, we saw a bit of a pause in the January, February sort of time frame as companies began to try to figure out what this environment was going to look like. But then come March, April, and May, we've seen placements begin to pick back up again. It was just a matter of, okay, we know what kind of environment we're going to have to deal with over the next year or two. And yeah, we might not hire as many, but we know we've got to get people into this industry given the distribution of the age of the workforce. So I think it is a hopeful sign, but we certainly shouldn't rest on our laurels. With that, we've got about 5 minutes here, so I'd like to open up for questions. It's a little bit hard for us to see up here, so if you would stand up, that would be great. Yes, sir.
Yes, Octavio Tripp. I'm the Consul General of Mexico here in Dallas. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear the whole intervention of the first speaker of the panel, but what I heard, but I'm happy with the part that I heard because talking about the possible collaboration with Mexico. But that is this is exactly what we are promoting with the new Texan authorities. More and better collaboration, not only with Washington, but with Austin as well. We already have a functional and institutionalized scheme of collaboration with Washington, dealing with security, environment, trade, and border infrastructure. But we require to do the same in order to create productive synergies with to the state level. So we are totally open to do that because we are ready to face shared responsibility on the border and to face joint challenges that we have in this part of in our border. So we are totally open to cooperate, and I really celebrate this spirit of cooperation. Thank you.
We look forward to it, and I'll hand you my card. You can call me anytime. We're glad to hear that. We want you to be successful because it makes us successful as well. So I think that's sort of the philosophy sitting up here. We want all 3 of our countries and nations to be successful in this energy industry. Thank you.
David?
There's been rumors that once the pipeline Keystone to the Pico power plant, we're going to move your oil to the West Coast and ship it overseas. Are you all going to wait long enough till our socialist president's gone before you make that?
Oh, thank you. Well, politics is politics, and that's good. I'm glad some people choose to make that a career. And some of them, the goal of a politician is to be elected, and the second goal is to get reelected. And if they cannot get reelected, the goal is to leave a good legacy, and only them can choose that. So I'm not going to judge that at all. What I am saying is that market fundamentals are what produces the best wealth economically, socially, and environmentally for citizens of all nations. It's well established. 5-year Soviet plans have shown what they produce. They produce anarchy and distortions and these economies of scale and all of that. So I'm saying free markets should prevail, properly regulated by powerful commissions like yours, Madam Chair, on a safety, environmental, and abuse of market power standpoint. We know how to do that well. Every day there is a set of regulators in North America who take care of these factors. Occasional errors, we learn from them and we move forward. The last stretch, I would say, for North America is, in your case, the reducing of the burden to export oil outside of the country, because it is demonstrated by way of applied and pure economics that it's a good thing for all. And the political factors, as George Harrison sang, all things must pass, and one day perhaps it will become possible.
Other questions? We got time for one more. You're letting them off easy. Let's go. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about students still knocking on the door wanting to take your classes, and I was noticing some people share with some slides with me that it seems like the graduation rate of petroleum engineers in the U.S. has followed rig counts perfectly since 1970. Up until about 2007, and since then, you've kind of had your rig count plateauing at around 2,000 rigs, but you have the student population, significant gaps between where they're at and where the rig count is, and now the rigs dropped even further. So are you concerned about too many students? Because I know we've got a lot, leaving our industry, but are you concerned at all with too many students?
Well, I would say no, because we need them. We really do have a huge gap, and a lot of people are retiring first and foremost. And it's not just the number of students, but it's also the quality of student. And so that's, I think, our biggest challenge. But I'm glad, and I encourage it every day to make sure we're educating students. But it's not just petroleum engineers we need geologists, we need seismologist in my agency right now, and a lot because there's room. This industry is going to continue to grow, so there's room for them to come in and have a good job, I think, long term. So I'm not concerned that we're overeducating. I know UT Austin, for instance, right now, because I'm sit on some boards, has capped their program numbers wise, because they don't want to see the glut like we had before. But I will say this, once an engineer, always an engineer, so there's always a room for some kind of engineer too. So I think we continue to need the volume.
I would agree with that. I mean, demographically, just the pure demographics, roughly 50% of this industry is within a year or two of retirement age across the board. Number two, this is a global industry, and for those companies or for those individuals that want to go overseas, whether it's West Africa, whether it's other areas, as commodity prices recover, there will be other opportunities as well. So I think there's adequate demand out there over the long run for the numbers that you're seeing. Well, the clock up here says 0 all the way across, so I want to thank all of our panelists here, and I want to thank the audience.